Hello, and thank you for joining today's special webcast, Achieving DEI Goals Through Transparency. I'm Regina Brayboy, Senior Fellow in the Human Capital Center here at the Conference Board. Today we will be discussing, I'm waiting for my slide to come up. Today we'll be discussing why good DEI governance matters, the DEI maturity model, demonstrating DEI commitment and progress, developing DEI disclosures, and selecting metrics. This webcast is approved for HRCI, SHRM, and CPE credits. If you haven't done so already, please click the link in the CEU request pod to sign up for available credits for this event. The pod is located in the bottom right corner of the webcast console. Remember to stay logged on for the entire webcast and to respond to the 3 pop-ups throughout the program. To get the most out of this webcast, make sure to utilize the engagement tools located at the bottom of your screen. Using these, you can ask questions to the presenters and download available resources. Please join me in welcoming Joanna Kim Bernetti, Chief Legal Officer and Executive Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at Trusaic. Joanna, a former partner with Atkin, Gump, Strauss, Heyer, and Felt LLP, has over 20 years of experience advising clients on a wide range of employment, tax, intellectual property, and other related business issues. Joanna holds a BS, Bachelor of Science degree in Chemical Engineering from the University of California, Berkeley, and a JD from Loyola Law School with honors. She was president of the Korean American Bar Association, Rising Star, Super Lawyers, co-chair of the various subcommittees under the American Bar Association and the Los Angeles County Bar Association. Joanna, take it away.
Thank you, Regina. And thank you to the members of our audience for attending today's webinar on achieving DEI goals through transparency. I'd like to take a sort of fundamental step back regarding the basic issue, good DEI governance, a platform which allows for greater transparency. Next slide. Now, why good DEI governance? Well, at a basic sense, it makes financial sense. And I listed here a famous statement from Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock. And what his statement really underscores is that in seeking profits, organizations also need to operate with purpose. And why? Because they're inextricably entwined together. So organizations need to operate with purpose beyond just short-term profitability. This means driving ethical behavior, guiding culture, and providing a framework for consistent decision-making. And so what you end up with is DEI is an integral function of an entity's business. And the net result you get is you help sustain long-term returns for the shareholder for your company. Next slide. So it shouldn't come as anyone's surprise that DEI, in fact, is tied to increased profitability. So here's just some couple of quotes some statistics that I found. Probably the more famous of the two is the McKinsey study. This was a 2019 study, and what they found was that executive teams in the top quarter of gender diversity were 25% more likely to have above average profitability than those in the bottom quarter. And this is up from 21% in 2017, and further up 15% in 2014. And then when you look at from a racial diversity stat, it's actually even more dramatic. For the 2019 figures, the top quarter as compared to the bottom quarter, there was 36% more likely to have above average profitability. So if your organization is all about profits, this is really sort of compelling stuff to say, hey, gender and racial diversity actually will make your business more profitable. And this statement is really echoed in the more recent study by Board Ready, which was conducted in 2021. And you see these increases in year-to-year revenues for organizations with better gender and racial diversity. This is also echoed in our own study. Trusaic had sponsored a study through Harvard Business Review in sponsorship with SHRM, which cemented the proposition that DEI increases profitability. And that study in 2021 found that the top third of successful DEI organizations saw greater revenue increases in the last 2 years than the bottom third. So all of these metrics are really underscoring the benefits, not just the ethical, moral benefit, but the actual financial benefit of DEI. Next slide. And indeed, when you're looking at actually the benefits on a more granular level, you see them in very practical terms. You see 5 times, 3 times, twice as more likely in terms of seeing improvements in attracting talent, retaining talent, team diversity, innovation, collaboration, employee engagement, all, basically are pieces that ultimately drive profitability. And these numbers are likely to increase. The sort of survey after survey, the generational expectations of younger talent places more emphasis on DEI. So next slide. And, there are a number of factors that are driving this trend for DEI ramping up. So in the 3 main categories, tight labor market, increasing public customer investor pressure, and increasing regulatory environment. And let me talk about each one of these in turn. So with respect to the tight labor market, there's just more choices for workers. I'm sure all of you have heard about the Great Resignation in the last couple of years. So many workers are changing jobs. And this is particularly so with the post-COVID zeitgeist in which remote working is the norm. And that's very painfully so in professional workforces where attracting talent is, really at the most competitive. Now, also, if you look at it from a public investor sentiment, like movements like Me Too, Time's Up, Black Lives Matter, and, the sort of the fallout from COVID, they've really made pay inequity and DEI just really sort of placing more emphasis in the public eye. There's also, from an investor standpoint, increasing trends towards corporate social responsibility, environmental social governance, focusing on the social of the ESG reporting. There's increasing movement towards standardization of reporting relating to organizational diversity, pay equity, and perhaps in the not too distant future, this sort of investor pressure will result in actual mandatory, obligatory reporting, particularly for global organizations. And then when we look at just the increasing regulatory environment, that comes in multiple pieces. Pay transparency, that's basically, the workforce get to see what they're being paid as well as the public. The requirements to post and disclose job salary ranges, that's evident, for example, in Colorado. This is mandatory transparency. We'll talk about voluntary transparency a bit later, but there is a trend towards pay transparency. There's pending legislation in California to that effect. Another area is pay data reporting. That's a little different than pay transparency, where you're disclosing, pay job ranges, salary ranges to your employees or to the public. Pay data reporting is about talking about your pay data submitted to a government agency. That might ring bells with regard to Component 2 EEO1 reporting that was in effect only for a couple of years. Not too surprisingly, some of the states have sort of filled the void. California started doing this pay data reporting a couple of years ago when the EEO1 Component 2 reporting was halted. And what that is basically that EEO1 Component 2 reporting, which is a number of, I think it's like 12 job classifications over 10 salary bands reported by race and gender, and California expanding that further, also, identifying a non-binary gender category. So all of that data, the sort of raw pay data for your organization, is now required in California and certain nexus, companies outside of California with some, applicable nexus to California. And then, as I had mentioned, there's also pending legislation in California that's going to enhance that law to actually require that pay data in some form to be disclosed to the public. There's also pay equity auditing and compliance. That is basically a requirement to conduct the audit so you can verify compliance with pay equity laws. Illinois is all over that, and that's been enacted for a while now, but it's going into effect next year or the year after. And that law, you do the pay equity audit, you then say, hey, we are in compliance with state and federal pay equity laws, and I'm going to certify it, signed by, an authorized person, typically like, the general counsel, chief financial officer of the company. So that's like serious business. So it's actually, in some respects, more challenging than California, because California is asking you to just submit all that data. Illinois is saying, hey, you have to certify compliance. So that's taking it a step further. I want to just note, if you're going to submit that pay data to California, it's not actually like under sort of general pay discrimination laws. Just because there's a raw pay gap, that doesn't mean you're engaging in pay discrimination. You would have to take the raw pay data and then further analyze it and sort of account for what's called wage influencing factors or legitimate business factors. One sort of obvious one would be tenure. Another one, merit. Like, the reason why John is getting paid more than Susie is because John has been at the job longer, or he has a degree and this job is benefited by that degree. So those kind of factors might take a giant pay gap and distill it down to what I'll just call a pay disparity. That's the sort of unjustified pay difference, and that's where the exposure for pay discrimination would come into effect. So if you're submitting all that raw data to California, it really behooves you to know sort of what is your actual risk, before you submit it. Another area, and I'll really sort of gloss over this, is sort of the broader coverage of what is permissible under pay discrimination. And really, in the last 5-6 years, states have been increasingly making it easier for employees to establish pay discrimination, harder for employers to defend against it, and also to encourage pay equity audits. Like Massachusetts, you could get essentially a free pass if you engage in a pay equity audit and, quote unquote, make reasonable progress towards achieving pay equity. So importantly, you don't actually have to achieve it. You're just getting, you're making reasonable progress towards it. So all of these sort of regulatory or legal pressures, pay transparency, pay data reporting, pay equity auditing and compliance certification, and broader scope of what constitutes pay discrimination. All of these elements are increasing pressure of employers to, get closer to pay equity. So, what the bottom line is, you need to have some kind of plan, with respect to pay equity and, in broader sense, DEI. Next slide. Okay, so where are you in your DEI plan? And I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of what the DEI maturity model that Trusaic has. Next slide. Okay, so the DEI maturity model, there's 3 tiers. There's one, the early or foundational. Second is sort of the intermediate, and the third is advanced. It's a spectrum, so we have them in sort of 3 distinct categories, but a lot of organizations will have a little bit of that, a little bit of this, and so it's really, kind of just a spectrum, and you can kind of fall, somewhere in you could potentially be high early, low intermediate, et cetera. And, notably, analytics are going to play a critical role in actually advancing to the higher levels. And why? Well, at sort of a foundational level, how are you going to know where you want to go if you don't know where you are? And if you put all the tools, policies, mechanisms, et cetera, to ascend to the next level, how do you know if you're getting any closer when you didn't know where you started, and how you're going to measure the difference of where you were and where you are now? and how are you going to get there, and how long did it take to get there? So, put another way, what gets measured gets managed, and conversely, what doesn't get measured may not get managed. This applies very much in the DEI framework. So you need to treat your DEI just like any other business function. So just like you wouldn't not measure your sales, you want to also measure your DEI progress. So we're going to go in a little bit more in depth with regard to each of the levels, and you'll get a copy of the slide. So you don't, I'm not going to go through each and every element just because we'll run out of time, but I will go into some detail. And, and it's important to know, like, this DEI maturity model, some people are farther along than others, and some are just beginning. And it's really not about, comparing yourself to other organizations in a vacuum. Like, for example, like larger organizations, certain government organizations, they may be further along than smaller private organizations. Everybody's going to be in their own place in their DEI journey, and no one should feel shame about it. It's about identifying where you are and moving forward with it. And even those folks in the top of the pyramid, because of the fluidity of the workforce, so where you might be one year could very much change the next year if you do nothing. So it's really important about, monitoring where you are, working towards progress, and, just really constantly improving. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is, level one, early. And in terms of the DEI model, this is where, frankly, a lot of organizations are in. Maybe they're a little bit at the top of the early, but, largely they're early. So you look at it and you see you'll see substantial gender or race, ethnicity, raw pay gaps, and as I talked about earlier, and actual pay disparities exist. They often get like a low diversity score because there's poor representation and utilization with regard to race, gender, disability, sexual orientation, and all the sort of other dimensions with respect to protected classes in, your typical discrimination context. So that would also include, ADA, which, is all, certainly something you want to also consider. So when you want to get to the next level, you're going to want at a minimum to put a DEI measurement system in place. You measure your baseline, acknowledge where you are, but now you know where you are, so you can figure out where you want to go. You define your goals. And also this is a sort of, real opportune time to communicate your commitment and progress to the appropriate stakeholders, whether they're employees, the public, investors, so on. Next slide. Next slide. So now at level 2, this is where organizations have made significant inroads in DEI success. And the metrics of these kind of organizations, one of the things that they often find are what are called root causes of pay disparities. And, a lot of times what these analytics of your pay data shows is you'll see odd clusters where they're outliers in what should be the pay for a particular department, for example. And when you run these analytics, you'll see that because of these outliers, it kind of really helps you identify, well, gosh, maybe that department is not behaving appropriately in pay, for example. Maybe there's a manager that's not doing what he or she needs to do. So running these analytics really helps you kind of identify, potential causes of pay disparities. And at this intermediate level, organizations will measure diversity, representation, utilization, across, the sort of typical protected classes, and you measure them against sort of appropriate, applicable organizations that are comparable to yours. And typically in these organizations, there is compliance with relevant pay equity laws. So, okay, that sounds like a pretty good place to be. Well, how are you going to get to the next level? Because now you're just really kind of doing the basic. As I talked about, these root causes, you identify them, and then you set initiatives to eliminate these problems. You regularly execute initiatives to address DEI. It's importantly, pay equity, there's a lot of laws around it. DEI is a little different in the sort of global sense. Like diversity, there's some diversity requirements internationally, for example, but it's been more problematic in the U.S. to sort of like create diversity requirements. There were some in California. There was a gender diversity requirement, racial diversity requirement of executive boards on publicly traded companies. And those have been challenged. What I like to say is, you want to move the needle, but you don't get to touch the dial. And so DEI measures are a lot about shaking that table to move that needle without touching the dial. So DEI or diversity, that's really for all the sort of trends that I had mentioned and the pressures to do so. It's a little different from pay equity, where there's just actual law that says you can't have pay discrimination. So there's a little bit more effectiveness in pay discrimination from a legislative hammer. And there's more of the sort of tight labor market, sort of investor public pressure to push forward on diversity. But advancing to the next level, especially if you are a global organization, you want to look at what's going on globally, because that's going to be sort of where the trend is to where organizations are going to be expected to comply. And these, internationally, DEI is there's really sort of more, there's more teeth that's going on. And often what happens internationally gets transplanted here and vice versa. So, one of the laws, for example, that was going on in California, the EEO-1 model is the one that actually took effect. But there was a competing bill in California that really looked exactly like the UK wage gap reporting. And this new legislation that I've mentioned that's right now like making its way through the legislature in California, that one is somewhere kind of in between that prior bill that looked like the UK model. And so, what's going on internationally is something that the states pay attention to, some of the states anyway. And so as an organization that has, even if you don't have a subsidiary or employees outside of the U.S., it's something to watch, because a lot of times, everyone's looking at what everybody else is doing from a legislative standpoint. And so you want, to kind of keep ahead of that, it's good to pay attention to that. So, you're at level 2, good place to be, but you want to move forward. You want to advance. And, to do that, eliminating root causes, trying to achieve these sort of global benchmarks for DEI, and really on transparency, communicating progress to your stakeholders, communicating a dedicated and ongoing commitment to achieving DEI, and basically considering what your employees, your consumers, investors, taking what they, sort of what their views are and making that part of your DEI plan. Okay, next slide. So, this is, level 3, that's the gold standard. And candidly, institutional investors are increasingly looking for corporations to hit this standard. And as I mentioned, even if you achieve this standard, it's not a stagnant standard, because what will happen is, as I mentioned, workforces are fluid. And really kind of elaborating on that, people get hired, people get fired, people get raises, people, potentially some people get demoted, their hours get cut. All of that sort of data is not fluid. And so what happens is, let's say you achieve, pay equity. Somebody, part of the data will change because someone left, for example. And then all of a sudden you don't have pay equity anymore. So it's like, it's very fluid. And so you need to engage in ongoing monitoring of that data so that you see sort of how you're moving, whether you're maintaining it, whether you're, whether it's going down, and then having, sort of remediation measures to fix it. It is something that isn't, something that you have to really be vigilant about on an ongoing basis. Next slide. Okay, so you know, at first blush, when you're, trying to achieve your DEI goals and then communicating that with your stakeholders, basically transparency, you're going to have to figure out where you are. And these are some of the questions that are, can help you understand where you are, to figure out, are you level 1, are you level 2, or are you level 3? Okay, and so, as I mentioned, you will get all these slides, so I'm not going to go through all of these in detail, but these are just some questions, and these questions can lead to even more detailed questions. And really, like, if you want to achieve DEI, what are the policies you have in place? What are the processes? What are you measuring? Who's involved? Are you in compliance with various laws? Are you sharing your commitment, goals, and progress with your stakeholders? Are you certified for pay equity? In other words, is there a third-party auditor or some third party that is saying that you have achieved equity, you've made a commitment to equity, so on? These are the kind of questions you'll want to ask yourself. Okay, next slide. So when you're trying to figure out where you are in your DEI plan, a precursor question might be, well, who the heck is responsible in our company for this? And some people will think it's like a person. And really, it is, I put this quote in here from Josh Bersin about accountability really being across the board. It's not, I think historically, certainly I've seen like, oh, that person's the DEI officer. She or he is going to handle all the diversity issues, all the equity issues. And that is a very poor way to do it, and often really just sort of perceived as lip service. And I've certainly seen that, unfortunately. And, consistent with this notion of it being like an all hands on deck, our HBR study found that one of the key obstacles to DEI success is accountability. And accountability, mind you, it doesn't have to be a stick. You can also do an incentive, an incentive way to achieve it. But it's important that you, and I'm going to get into this a little bit more, that you track it. It's not just, okay, well, here's the DEI person, let that person, have at it. And then just, you're done. It doesn't work like that. You set a team for DEI. You get full support by, at the executive level. You're going to want corporate counsel to provide guidance in your DEI planning to manage risk. And a myriad of studies have shown that C-suite level support is really important to make real progress. So it is all hands on deck, and you want to have some kind of incentive or disincentive for not making progress, or incentive for making progress, but you want to track that. Okay, next slide. All right, let's go to the first poll question. Can we launch that, please? Okay, the first poll question is, at what level of the DEI maturity model is your organization? And we're going to give it about 30 seconds for people to submit their answers. And remember, this isn't about shaming. It's about understanding where you are, and a surprisingly large number of organizations, maybe not so surprising, are in the early stage. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Okay, as I had mentioned, so what our survey that we just ran is, almost half of you are in the early, and another almost half are in the intermediate. It's a very small percentage that are in advanced. That's totally what I would have expected. I was glad to see a larger number in the intermediate, but we're looking at 43.2% in early, 44.6% in intermediate. And I'm going to talk to you about certification and in a little bit. But importantly, even if you're an early, like talking, like there is a certain general understanding that DEI is hard to achieve, but it's important for DEI to be a priority to work towards. And you can certify your commitment, towards DEI progress. You don't actually have to achieve all these sort of metrics, but that you have decided that it's important for DEI, that DEI is important to you. You've made a commitment to that. You are going to undertake certain measures to achieve that goal. You can certify on that. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now let's talk about demonstrating DEI commitment, progress, and sustainability. That's what I was just talking about with regard to certification. So now that you know where you are, how are you going to demonstrate that? And this is really where transparency comes in. High-performing organizations really see these sort of disclosures on, their pay data, their DEI numbers, et cetera. They really see that as more than a compliance requirement. They are looking at those DEI metrics to support their DEI narrative. And these disclosed metrics are going to be defined by the organization and should evolve as the circumstances of the organization changes. And every organization should, it's not a cookie cutter thing. The specific metrics, and we'll talk about that in a bit, the specific metrics aren't going to be identical for your organization. But you should report certain basic metrics like headcount, description of your human capital resources, your DEI profile. Mature organizations really seize this opportunity to bring in people-related topics to the attention of their stakeholders. Next slide. This is what I was talking about, consider certification. EDGE is an organization that provides that, very reputable organization. And, there's a new standard that's really emerging. EDGE certification has like 4 components. This is an integrated SaaS-based DEI solution. They provide certification at, basically one of 3 levels. It's, sort of analogous to what I had mentioned about the early, intermediate, and advanced. And this rigorous DEI certification platform takes into account representation, pay equity, policies and practices, and inclusiveness of culture, really sort of the sort of 4 basic tenets of DEI. And, whether it's you use EDGE or a different third-party auditing organization that provides certification, what it does is it really, allows you, one, to establish some credibility that you are serious about your DEI plan. And if you have aspirations to ascend the DEI maturity model, you're going to need to do that. And it most certainly demonstrates commitment to DEI, progress, sustainability. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about developing your DEI disclosures. This is where your transparency comes in. And you want to, demonstrate transparency to demonstrate commitment, progress, and sustainability for your DEI plan. So, what are the steps? Okay, next slide. There's a number of steps. Certainly first out of the gate, you want to define your team. And as I talked about, having like the DEI person is not the team. You're going to want people at the senior level. As I mentioned, you're going to want corporate counsel. You're going to also want to involve PR and communications and certain select contributors from all sort of HR functional groups. As well, not necessarily specifically in your team, part of a typical DEI plan will include an inclusion survey. And that's going to really get sort of it's hard to have, if you have 5,000 employees, you're having 5,000 people on your team. That's very unworkable. What you can do is have an inclusion survey that captures the sentiment of your employees. And some people, view inclusion surveys a little bit as a fluffy exercise. It's about perception, and that's not reality. But if you've got 90% of your employees believing that there is not pay equity at your company, you got a problem. Those are real numbers that are going to impact your DEI plan. And so inclusion survey really captures the views of your employees. Their inclusion surveys will have certain standard questions, and there'll probably be ones that are crafted specifically to your industry, other sort of uniqueness of your organization. It's really important to do one to really sort of capture a large number of folks. You can also do things like, sort of focus groups to also get that information. But you want to consider what your workforce, what their views are in terms of defining your team. Next slide. Okay, so you have your team in place. One thing to really consider is benchmarking against DEI leaders. This is what you aspire to be. Find out what people, organizations are doing that are similar to yours. It isn't about, just keeping up with the Joneses, but it helps you identify sort of what are more, what are other people doing? It's going to give you insight on things that you can actually apply to your organization. There's certain, indices that, like for example, Great Places to Work. That is a third-party organization that really, based on surveys of employees, et cetera, that have are considered a leader, for example. You could look at that and see, to identify certain organizations that might be, provide some insight into what would work for you. But basically, collecting an inventory of metrics, talking with leaders and companies that you admire, find out what their goals are, what they're doing. It's going to help you. This isn't about a blank slate and you just start like, what should we do? I mean, this will be a great place for you to get ideas that will be good for your organization. Next slide. Okay, step 3. So you've got some ideas, you got your team. Outline your DEI strategy. And as I said, part of that inclusion survey, that's going to give you some insight in like what kind of things you might want in your strategy. And the idea is you have these DEI disclosures. They're designed to communicate how your people support your business strategy. You want to have a DEI vision for your organization, and your disclosures are going to fit within that vision. Next slide. Okay, so what are the metrics you're going to use to display your DEI goals? So you're going to identify the metrics. You're going to figure out what you're going to measure, and you're going to identify what role these metrics will have in your disclosures, and again, in the narrative that you are trying to present with your DEI vision. So you start with implementing a measurement system. You want to confirm your system actually ensures data quality and integrity. And I want to just pause a moment for data quality. It is a huge problem. It's the elephant in the room. Nobody likes to talk about it. Like garbage in, garbage out. If you are running all these analytics on just unreliable data, while the analytics are done perfectly, you're still going to have garbage that comes out. It's going to be useless. It's not going to be reliable. So it's really, really important that you ensure that data is good data that you can rely upon. So you get these metrics, and you establish your baseline, sort of where you are, and then from that you can identify your goals. Okay, next slide. Okay, step 5. Formulating disclosures. What are you going to be transparent about? So you're going to transform your performance metrics into disclosures that resonate with your audience. So I talked about this vision. You have this vision of your DEI. You're going to basically look at the metrics that you have, and that's going to help support your vision. Now, it's important that transparency is overriding cherry picking. You want to be authentic. I mean, it may very well be that some of the metrics that you want to disclose that are really meaningful and important to your stakeholders, they don't look that great. Like, you need to make a lot of progress. But if you want to be authentic about your DEI plan, it may be that those are the numbers you disclose. And transparency is not a one-size-fits-all either. Pay data reporting is super granular. You've got it by job title, employee, how much they make, et cetera. Like, we're not talking necessarily about that. And frankly, there's going to be certain rules that you don't want to disclose that granular. But, the metrics that you provide, you may end up collating a ton of very granular data. And what you end up disclosing are more, general data that really sort of captures sort of where you are in your DEI picture. That's more likely the kind of transparency you're going to be engaging in. And, whatever those numbers are, if, let's say, you're at that early stage, you've decided that you want to show your commitment, that you're working towards getting there. As I said, a large number of organizations are in that bottom level. You want to show that you're making progress. And the first step is that here's where we are. This is where we want to be. Getting certified to that effect. This is all part of that plan. And so, it's something that you and your team are going to sort of strategize over, figuring out what you're going to be transparent about. But importantly, DEI, that commitment, progress, authenticity is very important. Okay, next slide. Okay, step 6, communicate, iterate, improve. As I said, even if you're at the top level, it's a moving target in some respects, trying to maintain equity, if you will, pay equity. And let's say you've hit all your DEI goals, it could change a year after just because people leave, so on. So, what you want is you want to communicate your commitment, the metrics that you choose to achieve, that you want to disclose, that's in line with your DEI plan. And as time progresses, you repeat the process and you make improvements consistent with your DEI strategy. Next slide. Okay, so let's go to the next poll question. Is your organization planning on disclosing DEI goal progress this year? Okay, let's give it a couple more seconds. Okay, let's see the results. That's great. 45% say yes, a little under 20% say no, 22% say maybe, and then 13.7% say not sure. So, as I said, as with the particular disclosures, the specific metrics, whatever your goals are, they're going to be different with your organization. There is a trend towards this transparency. People want to know that, all the trends that I talked about, they're pushing for that. So if you aren't planning on disclosing it this year, there should be some serious thought about disclosing it next year. Okay, next slide. Okay, we've been talking a lot about metrics, but we haven't really talked about, well, what are the metrics? So I want to spend a little bit of time on that. So successful organizations will measure D, E, and I. Diversity, D for diversity and representation, E for equity, which includes pay equity, which tends to be like the biggest headache in terms of analytics because it's so much data, so many analytics. And then I, inclusion. And so when you're looking at that, there are literally hundreds of different types of metrics you could measure. And, in picking the metrics, what's going to be important is what's important relative to your business. And, you can, look at sort of the nature of your business, the nature of your workforce. You're going to want to consider what's unique to your organization. There's going to be some basic stuff. And, obviously pay equity is a huge piece of it. It is one that really should be immediately done. And certainly that is step one in ascending the DEI maturity model. It's also like the thing that you need to do to stay ahead of pay discrimination, to comply with various pay data reporting mechanisms, pay transparency mechanisms. And it really, like, you need to know where you are, because that's really more of a sort of regulatory or legal hammer as opposed to diversity. And pay equity audits can be inexpensive to conduct, and they are clearly the necessary measurable insight that you need to figure out what your level of risk is with respect to your pay data. And when you consider that relative to liability, it is a good investment and an immediate step that can be taken. So other things to consider: diversity score, representation, sort of the pay quartiles, women, underrepresented minorities in leadership position. I mean, I talked about inclusion, other metrics, employee sentiment through, in various aspects, hiring, promotion, retention analysis by position type, job level in comparison with one another. In terms of, like, there's certain low-hanging fruit and sort of typical things that you're going to want. There's also like a pile of others. I'll just mention some of them: workforce size, composition, attraction, pay equity, diversity, inclusion, engagement, training and development, talent mobility, leadership development, workforce safety, workforce well-being. There's just so many things you can do. And, when you have your DEI narrative in place, that's going to, that's like the metrics that you decide that you're going to choose are going to flow from that. So, you have to remember, transparency and the underlying metrics that you're being transparent about, that you're going to disclose, that's going to be like driven by your DEI sort of vision. And so you want to prioritize the metrics that align with your narrative. Again, like, there's some basic ones you're going to want to disclose, but otherwise you're going to, sort of pick the metrics that are consistent with the narrative that you've presented as part of your DEI vision. You want to send a message that demonstrates that you care about your employees and their future. I mean, that's part of that authenticity. The metrics that really militate in favor of that kind of messaging, that's going to be important. And measuring DEI correctly and communicating the results is going to strengthen your connection with your employees and other stakeholders. Okay, next slide. Okay, so let's go to the last poll question. Would you like to learn about PayParity, an all-in-one DEI solution that helps you achieve your goals and share progress along the way? And PayParity is Trusaic's pay equity and DEI platform. And, it will give you all the analytics you need for your DEI. Okay, let's give that another 10 seconds. Okay, let's move on now. Next slide. Let's go on now to Q&A. Regina?
Yes, I am back with you. So we have a question. Our company just acquired another. The purchase company is more advanced from a pay equity maturity model. How do we reconcile our DEI strategy? I think it looks like Joanna might have, her screen is frozen, so I'm going to give her a few seconds to switch over. And, while we are waiting for Joanna to get back, I just wanted to cover a couple of things that, if you have questions, here's some information on Joanna. You have her email address, as well as the website, and also the address for Trusaic. And Joanna is coming back in, so we appreciate your patience. Joanna, are you there?
Hi, I'm sorry. I was having a little bit of a technical difficulty.
Okay. Well, what I'm going to do, I'm going to repeat the question for you. So the question that came in is, our company just acquired another. The purchased company is more advanced from a pay equity maturity model. How do we reconcile our DEI strategy?
That's a great question. In a typical sort of merger or acquisition, oftentimes the two different organizations, they don't have identical DEI strategies. And so, one of them could be farm. It's really a golden opportunity to, one, revisit of the less advanced organization. And I want to be clear, it may not be the exact same plan for, you may want to maintain it, but it is a time for both organizations to take a look at where they are and a great opportunity to make changes and improvement at that time.
Okay, great. And then the second question is, in procuring services and goods from a vendor, should their DEI status be considered when evaluating them?
Well, as the company, like getting service, or, your vendors and suppliers will reflect on you. And it's actually, for the purchasing or company to the DEI status of the folks that they're buying, goods and services, kind of insisting on a DEI strategy with you as an organization is a good way to promote your own DEI vision. Now, you often see, the sort of minority-owned business, and certain percentage veteran, that's really the same concept. Government contracts, whether federal or at state level, they will tie suppliers that sort of meet these sort of things. That's really the same concept. So it's a way to, use your dollars in goods and services to, really, show your commitment to DEI.
Great. And we have another question. We conducted a pay equity audit last December. How often should we repeat it?
Well, I think generally speaking, the audit, you really should do it once a year. And then, the basis, you want to track that. And I talked about it during the session about the fluidity of workforces. So, people don't get hired once a year at the same time. It's, it's just throughout the year, and people get promoted. And so, when you do the pay equity audit, it also creates kind of a baseline. So you take that baseline, and then over the course, you're tracking all this data, and you're sort of measuring that, like how that's changing over time. And monitoring that is actually really helpful because you have one data point from, say, year 2021, year 2022. That's a little too coarse, finer analysis. And so, seeing how it changes. So let's say you ran in 2021, and then say on a monthly basis, you see how it changes. And it also gives you maybe, I talked about earlier about outlier potentially showing like a hot cluster of this particular department, men are getting paid what is predicted in your pay equity audit. Basically, when you do pay equity audit running, I'm not going to purport to know all the sort of details of multilinear, but that's it's a statistically you know, soundmatize your data. And so when you run this statistical analysis on the data you have, it shows what that position show. Let's say you're running this every month, like, just for progress. Particular department, like, all the men are getting paid like a lot more than the women. Or it's happening over the course of the year, for example. That gives you insight into that and see if there's a problem. I'm not saying that there is, but what it tells you is you should look. That's really why conducting a pay equity audit is very monitored on an ongoing basis.
Great. And I think we can get maybe another question in, which is probably a good one to end with. What are the biggest challenges in starting a DEI plan?
Well, to answer that, I was very, that our audience, something north of 40% are in that sort of thing. But there's also about 40% in the early category. It's really to get management buy-in. That's probably one of them. And because of that, it's sort of like, okay, well, we want to commitment to DEI progress, and but we're not really sure. In that sort of roadmap that I gave you, it was like sort of the 6 steps. First, and part of that is the management buy-in. You want the management to, be part of that DEI vision. Like, they're going to be, and that's really the biggest, in my opinion, that's the biggest challenge. Like, so, hey, we need to do this, and then get the pertinent players involved in making that decision. So that's probably the biggest challenge. Probably lesser of a challenge, but still a challenge, is getting all the data. So, as I said, tricks that you that you are going to measure. You have your team, you come up with a plan, figure out the metrics, and that I wouldn't call it a hurdle in terms of starting it, but it is something that you're going to have to pay attention to, have reliable data. So that's another, issue with that. And our PayParity solution really addresses that, and really helpful towards that. Run out of time for any more questions, so let me turn it back over to you, Regina.
Okay.
And thank you. Might want to go to the next slide.
So, yes. So thank you, Joanna. That was great. If you enjoyed today's program, please visit conference-board.org/webcast for a full roster of upcoming webcasts. In addition, CEO Perspectives is a new monthly podcast, no longer than 30 minutes, which presents a curated list of the top insights created over the last month by center by the Conference Board. The podcast is hosted by our CEO, Steve Odland, and the content is aimed at CEOs and their direct reports. Listen and subscribe to this new podcast channel by going to our website or wherever you find your podcasts. We are proud to announce we have recently launched MyTCB. MyTCB is a new members-only website offering members a curated and personalized view of the full range of membership benefits available from the Conference Board. Here you can view the latest research and insights, conferences and events, data and benchmarking tools, peer networks, and access experts in one centralized place. Sign in and check it out today. Finally, join us in New York City on September 29th and 30th for the Women Lead 2032 Festival. This fantastic event will celebrate some of the nation's and the globe's top women leaders in business, nonprofits, science, and the arts. Thanks again, Joanna, and thanks to all of you for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you.